I am Dracula.
Arguably the most popular and influential Universal monster movie of the studio's golden age is 1931's Dracula, the English language version. Don't worry, we'll get to Spanish Dracula later. The road from Bram Stoker's book to director Tod Browning's film was a long one, filled with potholes, detours, and lawsuits. Bela Lugosi's seminal performance defined vampires in pop culture, and most fictional creatures of the night still live in his shadow. So how did Universal's groundbreaking adaptation reach the silver screen, and why is it still so beloved? Let's bite into this classic and find out. A solicitor named Renfield is on a business trip to Transylvania, finalizing a deal on an English residence called Carfax Abbey. The buyer is a local count named Dracula. Many people in the neighboring villages warn Renfield that the Count is a vampire who can transform into a wolf or bat, and with his wives, feast on the blood of helpless victims. Renfield dismisses the warnings as superstition and eventually reaches Castle Dracula. The Count himself is a charming but intimidating presence in his massive empty home. Soon, the solicitor sees that he's in the middle of a nightmare and is preyed upon by Dracula. The next day, we find Renfield under control of the vampire as they travel by ship to London. Dracula rests in one of the coffins brought along containing the soil he was buried in until the sun goes down. He then kills every man on board, leaving behind only the dead captain tied to the ship's helm and a raving mad Renfield. The solicitor is committed to Dr. Seward's sanitarium, located next to Carfax Abbey, as Dracula ingratiates himself to the doctor and his family. Seward's daughter Mina, her fiancé John, and her best friend Lucy are intrigued by the Count's charisma and foreign disposition. Along with other casualties around town, Lucy quickly turns up dead with bite marks on her neck and a large loss of blood to blame. Dr. Seward becomes highly concerned and consults Dr. Abraham Van Helsing. It's his opinion that the culprit is Nosferatu, aka an undead vampire. Van Helsing is brought in to help stop the phenomenon as Mina is targeted by the bloodsucker with the reluctant help of Renfield. The history of Universal's Dracula picture is almost as entertaining as the movie itself. This was the official kickoff to the studio's Monster Classics legacy in a decade of unforgettable films. For many years, it was the standard bearer for Universal and the top of the heap for memorable early horror films. Like plenty of popular movies, it all started with a book. Bram Stoker published the Dracula novel in 1897. The titular villain has gone on to become one of the most adapted characters in literature, with dozens of incarnations from stage to screen, big and small. One of the earliest adaptations, and what's recognized as the character's first film, is the 1921 Hungarian silent movie, Dracula's Death. While it's been lost for decades, the film was reported to have little to no resemblance to Stoker's novel. The story followed a man in an insane asylum who claimed to be Dracula and later asks to be shot to prove his story. The man dies, but it's left unanswered what his true history was. Dracula's Death is notable, but it was made without the permission of Stoker's widow Florence, and thus unofficial. Yet, copyright violations didn't stop F.W. Murnau and Prana Film from producing the still popular German expressionist classic Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, in 1922. Stoker's wife infamously won a court case to have all copies of the movie destroyed, but much like Count Orlok, the movie has survived well past its supposed expiration date. When it comes to stage performances, Bram Stoker himself wrote a 4-hour-long adaptation of his own work that was only performed once in 1897 to protect his ownership of the story. By 1924, British producer Hamilton Deane had debuted a new stage version that became immensely popular all over the world, including a run on Broadway that was revised by American playwright John L. Balderston. This play ended up being the main source the 1931 film drew from, including the look of Count Dracula, which was significantly altered from Stoker's description. Bela Lugosi, Edward Van Sloan, and Herbert Bunston played Dracula, Van Helsing, and Dr. Seward respectively. All three were later brought in to reprise their roles in the movie. Universal was supposedly thinking of adapting Dracula back in 1915 as a silent picture, but studio readers found it unfilmable in those days. Even though The Hunchback of Notre Dame and The Phantom of the Opera were huge hits for the studio, owner Carl Laemmle wasn't a big fan of horror films, and it took his son, Carl Jr., to finally make Dracula happen. He was able to convince his dad after telling him other studios were looking to gain the film rights. With his son as the producer, Laemmle Sr. reluctantly agreed under the condition that Lon Chaney starred as the vampire. Jr. was already hoping for the acting legend to take up the role, in addition to also playing Van Helsing. Chaney seemed to decide against becoming involved when he re-signed with MGM for 3 years. He would pass away of lung cancer and a throat hemorrhage in 1930 at the age of 47. The onset of the Great Depression affected Laemmle Jr.'s work on the project, but he pressed on. Back in 1929, Universal planted fake stories about how their Dracula production was going to start principal photography soon before they even acquired the rights. Paul Lenny was promoted as the director, with Conrad Veidt as Dracula. Unfortunately, Lenny died of blood poisoning in September of 1929, and Conrad Veidt returned to his home country that same year, concerned about starring in American talkies with his German accent. Despite these setbacks, Universal secured the film rights to Dracula for $40,000 in 1930. Tod Browning was brought on as director, known at the time for 1927's London After Midnight and 1930's Outside the Law, plus many other credits. Browning's voice is actually heard when unsuspecting Londoners discover the ship ravaged by Dracula.
Here now, get back.
Captain dead, tied to the wheel. Horrible tragedy, a horrible tragedy.
Bela Lugosi lobbied hard to play the lead vampire on screen. For whatever reason, he wasn't at the top of the production team's list, regardless of playing Dracula on stage for years. As other candidates fell by the wayside, they made Lugosi a low-ball take-it-or-leave-it offer, and with no other option to get the part, he accepted. With the major players finally in place, Dracula at last officially entered production. Originally, the movie was going to stick closer to the novel with a big budget, but because of the Depression, they were forced to scale back and chose to model the film on the famous stage play. Ultimately, Dracula was given a $355,000 budget and started shooting in September 1930. Unusually, it was filmed roughly in sequence with the events of the script. The crew finished principal photography 6 days late, but came in $14,000 under budget. Additional scenes and retakes were filmed in December. Shot simultaneously on the same sets was a Spanish-language version of Dracula, directed by George Melford and starring Carlos Villarreal. Since talkies were still in their infancy, Latin countries were eager to hear dialogue spoken in their own language. Dubbing was considered cheating back then, so Universal decided to produce an entirely separate film with a budget of $66,000. Melford's crew shot overnight after Browning's wrapped their production day. They were able to review Browning's dailies and attempted to top his work. Many have praised the Spanish-language film as superior, and they're right. Outside of Bela Lugosi's performance, this really does have the leg up. The English-language film was shot by innovative German cinematographer Karl Freund. Plenty of sources online also give him co-directing credit, claiming he took over those duties for much of the shoot. Within his legendary filmography, Freund shot Fritz Lang's Metropolis and would go on to direct The Mummy for Universal in 1932. There are moments featuring the dynamic camera movements that Freund was known for, along with striking lighting setups, but much of Dracula sees his talents a bit restrained. Highlights include some of the backgrounds near Castle Dracula. They were pulled off by placing painted glass in front of the lens, creating some impressive-looking in-camera landscapes. At times, that strong work is weighed down by puzzling visual decisions by either Browning or Freund, such as when Dracula shows up at the London theater to meet our protagonists. His initial interaction with Dr. Seward is conducted a step below the box, which makes the menacing villain look short in stature. It even fooled critics at the time who commented on Lugosi's height. In reality, the actor was 6'1" and taller than Seward's actor, Herbert Bunston. There's no doubt that Bela Lugosi is still thought of by most fans as the definitive on-screen Dracula. Even if people don't know his name or have never seen this film, they know his intonations, his movements, his poise. They're synonymous with Dracula and vampires in general.
Children of the night, what music they make. I never drink. Why?
"I want to suck your blood" has gotta be up there with "Luke, I am your father" as famous movie lines that were never actually said by the original character. Lugosi's accent and demeanor is so cemented into pop culture that we attribute stuff like this to him. His Dracula also defined what vampires were supposed to look like. How many Halloweens over the years have you seen kids dressed up like him without even knowing it? We can trace this specific look back to the 1924 play, which did away with the novel's white-haired, mustachioed nobleman monster and replaced him with a younger, debonair magician. Seriously though, they used stage magicians as an influence for the character's wardrobe, and it works great. It's not Stoker's Dracula, but Lugosi was apparently proud of that. He was happy that his version of the character was his own. Does the performance hold up now? Oh yeah, I think so. There's an intangible appeal about this guy that still pops off the screen.
There are far worse things waiting man than death.
Lugosi doesn't turn in the only iconic performance here. Dwight Fry clearly had a ball hamming it up as Renfield. It's second only to Dracula as a character archetype that continues to be used in this actor's image. That laugh is nuts and memorable as hell. Fry's line delivery nearly steals the show.
Rats. 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 Thousands. Millions of them.
Edward Van Sloan as Van Helsing also turns in an indelible performance.
Yes, Nosferatu. The undead. The vampire.
He goes toe-to-toe with Lugosi and comes out not being overshadowed, which couldn't have been easy.
I will find your earth box and drive that stake through your heart.
Your will is strong, Van Helsing.
Indeed.
Even though Van Sloan played Van Helsing on Broadway, he was apparently bored of the character and wanted to try playing Renfield. That would have been an interesting twist on things. Everyone else in the movie is okay. They're not bad, but kind of dull in comparison to the more attention-grabbing turns. The depth that Stoker's novel gave to Harker, a very different version of Dr. Seward, and especially Mina, was sorely missed. I can say I remember Charles K. Gerard as Martin.
He's crazy. They're all crazy. They're all crazy except you and me. Sometimes I have me doubts about you.
Definitely an awkward type of comedic relief for a movie like this, but how he says crazy is pretty great. When Van Helsing notices Dracula casts no reflection, he identifies him as their vampire. However, things only get worse. Renfield attempts to resist his master's bidding, but is unsuccessful and keeps creating opportunities for the Count to strike. Under a trance, Mina is forced to drink Dracula's blood and begins her transformation into a creature of the night. Meanwhile, a figure called the Woman in White attacks local children after dark. This is revealed to be Lucy risen from the grave. Mina tries to attack John, only stopped by a crucifix, and that night, Dracula enchants a nurse to open Mina's bedroom window. The Count steals away his new bride to Carfax Abbey, where Van Helsing, Harker, and Renfield give chase. Renfield is killed by the undead being, who is soon after discovered resting in his coffin by our heroes. Van Helsing plants a stake into Dracula's heart, finally killing him, releasing Mina from his influence, and curing her of her vampirism. The betrothed then embrace in relief and leave Carfax Abbey together. Dracula hit movie screens in February of 1931 to box office success. Critics felt mostly positive about it, and Bela Lugosi was made a horror icon. Audiences were creeped out. The mystique of the film drew in curious viewers. Universal's advertisements were unique, including the initial marketing as a sort of romance. The mystery and anticipation of a frightening good time also pulled in a younger audience than was intended. According to a featurette on the Blu-ray, kids liked Dracula. The film's demographic reached far and wide, and its lasting legacy as a cinematic favorite speaks for itself. Claiming to be the first supernatural horror movie of the sound era, it surprised me to find out a silent version with intertitles was made available to theaters that weren't yet converted for audio. You can still feel the influence of silent cinema in Tod Browning's direction and the somewhat limited dialogue. There's also almost no music in the movie. Of course, everyone knows about the Swan Lake orchestration when the title card appears. It does a great job of setting the mood, and Universal later used the same theme in 1932's Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Mummy. But that's the first of only 2 times music is played at all. The second instance is during the London Symphony Orchestra scene, and that's supposed to be diegetic music, heard within the story and by the characters. In the infancy of the sound era, movie studios were afraid audiences would reject or be confused by music that wasn't heard inside the contents of the film. That's why it was barely used here and during the concert sequence. I think it does make the movie strangely quiet in moments where it didn't need to be. Personally, I don't like wall-to-wall film scores when they're not called for, but a few well-placed melodies would have gone a long way to increase the suspense in Dracula. Keep in mind, this is hindsight from a modern perspective. If you want to see Dracula with an official, full original composition, it is available. In 1998, composer Philip Glass put together a musical accompaniment. It's an extra feature on many of the home releases. The alternate score is good stuff and does help the film in some areas. However, it kind of has the opposite problem of the original. The music never stops. On the Blu-ray I have, it's also poorly mixed with the film's natural audio and removes Swan Lake from the beginning, which I think is a huge mistake. Moviegoers in 1931 weren't used to seeing the horrific imagery Bram Stoker presented in his novel. Thus, Dracula's more graphic or controversial moments were toned down or omitted completely. It's a bit absurd to think that no fangs or bite marks are ever shown on screen. Barely any blood is visible, and the Count isn't depicted actually feeding on Renfield, Lucy, or Mina. Lugosi must have tried to compensate for the fangless vampire with that pained expression he uses when advancing towards his victims. It's kind of silly looking now, but without the sharp teeth selling those shots, he had to try something. Dracula's off-screen death groans were cut for nearly 60 years before Universal eventually restored them on the Laserdisc release. The movie already has a bit of an anticlimactic ending, so I can't imagine watching a version where we don't at least hear Dracula die. There was also an afterword by Van Helsing carried over from the stage play. He would hope the audience not be consumed by bad dreams of what they just witnessed, but flip the script by ending his speech with a reminder that when it comes to the horrific and supernatural,
There are such things.
footage of this epilogue must not be salvageable enough to be fully restored, but Universal did provide a short glimpse of it in their Road to Dracula featurette. It was reportedly censored to not intrigue viewers with a belief in the occult or offend religious groups. What would have offended people in a different way was the bat plane Dracula was going to use to travel to London in an earlier draft of the script. That's right, instead of a ship, he was supposed to commission a custom airplane complete with wings in the shape of bats. This is according to film historian David Scull's commentary on the film. I mean, it would have been different. While the plane didn't make it on screen, this piece of cardboard somehow did. This thing shows up in multiple scenes, and I guess nobody noticed it. I'm sure a grip on set clipped it to the lamp to properly light a certain shot, but the fact that it was never taken away and is decently well known to fans now makes it a fun quirk to the production. Another, coincidence, we'll call it, is that Helen Chandler, the actress who played Mina, was married to Cyril Hume during the making of Dracula. Hume would go on to write a little 1956 sci-fi movie called Forbidden Planet. Yep, if you're familiar with my Twilight Zone reviews, you know I just can't seem to get away from this movie. Even in a totally differently themed month. It's crazy. I digress. I learned all this by way of the abundant amount of special features on the 4K Blu-ray. If you're a fan of Dracula or film history, the behind-the-scenes information presented is fascinating. Carl Laemmle's niece, the late Carla Laemmle, even hosts one of the featurettes. She actually appeared in the film way back when and was given the first line of the whole thing.
Among the rugged peaks that frown down upon the Borgo Pass are found crumbling castles of a bygone age.
As for the main cast, Lugosi, Fry, and Van Sloan would show up in more similar roles for Universal. Van Sloan even reprised his part of Van Helsing for the 1936 sequel, Dracula's Daughter. As we go along here, you'll see them pop up more. Dracula is still an enjoyable peek into a time period that kickstarted how we view these characters in modern culture. Some of the shots, sets, and performances are fantastic, but I'd be lying if I said the movie was perfect. Maybe that's because I enjoyed the folklore angle of the original novel and the chilling scares of 1922's Nosferatu more. I just think the overall story and characters are meant to be deeper and more interesting than how they were presented here. If you know Stoker's novel, you'll quickly realize that things are quite different when the film opens on Renfield traveling to Castle Dracula instead of Jonathan Harker. One of the writers supposedly thought Renfield was more interesting, and seeing the origin of he and the Count's association was more effective. It also eliminated the awkward return of Harker to London later in the story. Because this movie is only 74 minutes, I can appreciate the thought process of consolidating characters and settings, but it also made our protagonists, Mina in particular, much less compelling. There's no denying its place in history, though. 1931's Dracula is legendary for good reason. Be sure to check out my Walter Culture channel and stay tuned right here to Juniversal, because next time, we meet the monster.
He's crazy.